All right, and we are live. At least I hope we are. Thanks to everyone for joining us. I realize many of you are joining us for the second time after we had to reschedule from last week, so thanks for coming back. I'm LinkedIn Learning Senior Staff Instructor Garrick Chow. So something I don't really talk about much on this platform is that in addition to my career at LinkedIn, I've been playing in a rock band since the mid 90s. And it was during the early days of the band when I first encountered my guest today, John Faye. And we've been traveling in each other's circles ever since. John is the lead singer and primary songwriter of the Caulfields, who were signed to and released 2 albums on A&M Records. If you were listening to the radio or watching MTV back then, you probably heard their single Devil's Diary. Since then, John has been working pretty much nonstop in music, forming multiple bands, performing as a solo artist, releasing a ton of albums, teaching classes in songwriting at Drexel University. The list of his accomplishments just goes on. And now to add to that list, he's released a memoir called The Yin and the Yang of It All, Rock and Roll Memories from the Cusp, as told by a mixed up, mixed race kid. This book is filled with engaging, deeply personal, and sometimes deeply funny accounts of his life in and out of the music industry. And I'm so pleased to be able to talk to him today again. Hey, John, thanks for joining us.
Garrick, I've been sitting in the same position in the same shirt for a whole week.
So that is dedication, absolute dedication.
And I assume we are, in fact, live.
We are live. I've double checked it so people can see us. But I do want to add anybody who's watching, please post in the comments, say hello, let us know where you're watching us from. If you have questions and comments, please add them. But basically, just let us know you're there. So, because last time we went almost, I don't want to dwell on this, but almost a full 10 minutes just conversing, having a great chat, but then
it was a lovely time.
Yeah, finally realizing the stream had failed. So, and we were solving world problems. I was being really witty. It was just
this close to world peace.
We will try to recapture some of that magic. But okay, so just to sort of jump back in and sort of, set our foundation here. I do have to say, John, after, knowing you all these years, it was so cool to be able to sit down and just read this book about your life told in your own words, from your own perspective. And because I listened to the audiobook in your own voice. But having finished the book, this is really a story I think that can just appeal very strongly to people who don't know you. There are just so many universal themes about identity and family and just sort of trying to find one's place in the world. Mm-hmm. I think anybody can obviously relate to that. But maybe we could step back first and maybe you could talk a little bit about what drove you to write this book in the first place.
Well, I think that as I've had so many experiences over 30 plus years of playing music, the amount of strange occurrences that have happened in my life and career basically have created a situation where literally everyone I know, if I tell them one of my stories, they're like, that could only happen to you, dude. You should write a book about that. So I've always kind of had that in my head, but I didn't really seriously think about writing a book until around 2012 when my mom passed away. Because in remembering her, so I remember being at her funeral service and they printed out these very nice, little remembrance booklets. And even though that was a step up from, sometimes you just get the one little business card size thing that, serves as the remembrance of somebody who passed away, even with a more substantial remembrance, it still felt very surface and Reader's Digest-y to me.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, Mom's story was so interesting and in my opinion, like far more compelling than my own. But I wasn't in a position to do like a full-on biography of her. But I did feel that because our lives were so intertwined and she was such a looming figure in my own life, that by telling my own story, I could tell some of her story and hopefully honor her story as much as I could.
That was really, I think, one of the things that surprised me the most about the book is while you're ostensibly writing about yourself, you really are writing about your mom and her sort of ubiquitous presence in your life. In fact, I really enjoyed the device you used in the book where you have the chapters called Letters to an 8x10, where you're basically speaking directly to your mom in these chapters telling various stories about her and the stories that she played a role in. And it sounds like that was sort of always was that how you started, basically, almost like in a conversation with your mom to get this book going?
There was a point very early on in writing the book, and remember, I'm a first-time author. I was really in the dark, trying to figure out how to do all this.
Yeah.
There was a point where I was like, I'm just going to write the whole thing as a letter to my mom, and then certain instances and elements, the more I thought about trying to fit them into that conceit, it didn't make sense and it didn't work. So
Yeah.
I decided then that maybe during key points throughout the book, I would write these letters to this 8x10 photo that I'm actually looking at across the room in my apartment right now. And that served as kind of this anchor throughout the book that allowed me to always kind of bring it back to her influence in my life, regardless of what had happened to me professionally or personally.
Yeah, and I think as a device, it just works so well because you're telling these disparate stories as you travel through, and a lot of times it's nonlinear storytelling, which I really appreciate because it just sort of fits the entire narrative. But as you say, you anchor it by bringing it back, and I think the chapters where you're talking directly to your mom almost are the most personal, where you're kind of just bearing everything. It almost felt like, were you saying things through your writing that you didn't get a chance to say to her in real life?
That you hit the nail on the head. You might relate to this as a musician. Like, so much of what we do as creative people is in a large sense done because we need release or catharsis. And my being able to say those things in written form to my mom was incredibly therapeutic for me. And the only regret being I wasn't able to say those things while she was alive. But I think it took the perspective of her being gone for a while and some time and distance to be able to examine some of those things and really see them for what they were. Because if you're too close to something and not enough time has gone by, you're not really looking at it objectively.
Yeah, and as you say, it is sort of a shame that sometimes those words don't come until after it's too late.
Yeah, well, I guess it's never too late. I mean, obviously, it would have been nice to be able to connect on that level with my mom while she was still alive. But that's kind of part of the human experience. I think there's a lot of instances of that happening in our lives.
For sure. Let's go back to you talk about, like, this is your first time writing a book. Like, what were the things that surprised you most about writing in this form versus being a songwriter? What really jumped out at you in terms of that?
It's obviously quite a different experience. I mean,
because a lot of your songs are very personal. You've shared a lot about yourself throughout your entire life, I think.
That's really very true. I do think that even the most personal songwriting has this layer of protection around it that personal memoir writing doesn't, because in music you have the instrumentation, all the other things that are going on in a song that in addition to the sentiment or the lyrics. But when it's just your words on a page, there's a nakedness to that I think felt very different to me.
Yeah.
And I really feel that being that vulnerable was something very important to writing the book. You can't take these events and sort of whitewash things about yourself that are perhaps not the most flattering.
Yeah, right.
Either in your deed or your word. And so I think that in comparing writing the book to songwriting, I was actually trying to incorporate as much of what I knew as a songwriter into writing the book as possible. So
interesting.
I would never say to myself a chapter was done until I read it out loud and it sort of had a rhythm and a cadence to it that felt comfortable to me. Even if something read just fine on the page, if it wasn't coming out of my mouth in a way that I found almost lyrical,
Mm-hmm.
then I didn't consider it finished.
That's so interesting you say that, because as I mentioned, I listened to the audio version of your book, which you yourself read, and it definitely has a flow and as you say, a cadence to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's really so cool to hear that you really did that yourself to find out how it flowed.
I think that was just my way of incorporating something that I feel like I have a handle on in a
Right.
thing
Yeah.
that I had no idea how to do.
The tools that you had available.
Yeah, the tools I had
Yeah.
available, for sure.
Amazing. I like what you're saying about how, you basically, as you say, had to reveal yourself, had to just have this sense of honesty, even though it might not have made you look great in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
There was that story we've talked about before, where you and the Caulfields were playing in the South, and David Duke showed up at your show.
Yeah.
And you say in the book how well, could you tell a little bit about that story?
Sure. So, I mean, the context of the story is we were on tour in 1995, and the Caulfields had a song on the radio called "Devil's Diary," and the chorus of this song is extremely blasphemous. It's a play on the old John Lennon quote,
Sure.
and the chorus is "I'm bigger than Jesus now." So when you're, touring around in a band and that's your song on the radio, you're going to have places that embrace that song, and you're going to have places in the country where maybe you feel like you're getting a little pushback or backlash or whatever.
Sure.
But ironically, this was on a day before we were going to play in New Orleans, Louisiana, which, yes, it is the South, but New Orleans is a whole sort of culture of its own and in and of itself. So the song was actually very popular on the radio in New Orleans. And what happened was our manager realized that we had a day off before that show. So him maximizing every opportunity,
Sure.
booked us in this sort of like, rundown nightclub in Slidell, Louisiana, which is about, I don't know, 45 minutes to New Orleans. And so backstage at this club, the manager of the venue knocked on the door and basically was like, by the way, David Duke is here.
And just so people know, David Duke.
If you don't know who David Duke is,
Grand Wizard of the KKK, right?
He's a former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And of course, my joke in the book is that everybody in the band sort of like didn't really hear that right away, but my manager and myself, and I said, leave it to the half Asian and the Jewish guy in the room to know exactly who former Grand Wizard of the KKK was. So within minutes, we were just, confronted with meeting this guy. And the funny thing, and I'll give it away because that's part of the story, is that, because we thought he was there to like kill us. And the funny thing was, he really was just there because he knew his daughter liked the Caulfields. Right. And he wanted our autographs.
Hey, music builds bridges, right?
Well, you could look at it that way, but I think one of the reasons I told that story, and maybe that's what your question was getting at, is it was sort of part of a pattern in my early life where I was confronted with situations where a stronger, more confident version of me would have spoken up and not given that guy an autograph and told him to get the hell out.
Yeah.
But because of, as I looked back while writing the book, I had a history of feeling silenced, feeling marginalized, feeling that it was easier and safer for me to not speak up.
Right.
I think that is what basically caused my complicity in that situation. And the rest of the band was probably equally fearful, or maybe not quite as fearful as me.
Sure.
Being the Asian guy, but
right.
I've always held that in my memory as an event where if I could take it back and act differently, I would.
Yeah.
But it's been a journey over the course of decades to get to the point where I now feel like I can use my voice the way I want to use it. I feel safe expressing myself freely in a way that in some instances back then I didn't.
Would you say it's sort of was one of those seminal moments where, because of the way you reacted or didn't react, it sort of helped develop you into or helped develop the voice that you have now?
It's definitely a step toward that, but
Yeah.
there were probably many other less bizarre but equally powerful instances of my not speaking up that occurred over the years, even since then, that I have to look back and re-examine how I behaved. So I think that it's just sort of proof that we are all works in progress, and that you come to embracing your own voice over time. Very few people just come out and just have it and are able to express it in that way. Particularly, if we're talking about like what you and I have in common, being Asian Americans, I'm sure that we've both had experiences, especially in our younger formative years, when we have felt like it was easier to just sort of be docile.
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, I would say that, talking about your development, you kind of see that picture all the way through your book, but you do talk a little bit about, or actually I think significantly about, your childhood and being bullied as a kid. And your description of your childhood definitely gave me a lot of flashbacks to my own childhood. Something that you wrote that I jotted down here that jumped out at me was, and while I thought that I was no different, and while I thought I was no different from any other American kid, I love the shit out of apple pie. I can tell you that enough ignorant people planted enough seeds of doubt in me that I became convinced that I was different, and not yet in a good way, which, I think is a refrain that many, especially first generation kids growing up in the country feel. Because I think we all have that period, or that we all have that experience where for the first years of your life, you're kind of blissfully unaware that anyone thinks you're lesser or different. And then you get to, school, and the first time some kid pulls his eyes up around you, or, uses a slur, we don't even have the vocabulary as kids to express how that makes us feel, but we know that somehow we're different, and we weren't aware of that.
And the more it happens, the more it sort of seeps in a very kind of insidious way. Because you've seen the book, and you've seen the back cover of the book. So there's a picture of me on the back cover of the book where it's like this confident all-American little boy. I'm probably in the neighborhood of like 3 years old, and I'm wearing a like red, white, and blue, like, couldn't be more all-American looking little Speedo bathing suit, and I'm dragging a wiffle ball bat behind me, and I look like I'm about to like kick ass in whatever I choose to do. And that kid went away, very, very shortly after my father died, which was when I was 6 years old. And that obviously coincides with the beginning of elementary school and those years. And those were not the easiest years for me because of stuff like that. Not only did I feel like my protector was gone, but I was sort of out in the world with, very little context of who I actually was. Nobody would look at me and assume that I had a white father. I was identified as, a chink or a Jap or what have you.
And as you point out in the book, there were very few slurs aimed at Koreans at that time too. You just kind of, not only were you not getting slurred the right way,
all your slurs, or the people using the slurs were co-opting or whatever. I don't know.
So there's like multiple levels of racism going on.
And that's what made it feel even more discombobulating, is that I'm being called these names with such mockery and or malice behind them, and yet it's like, I'm not even that. I'm not that.
Exactly. You don't have time to explain all that.
I don't have time to explain because I'm my carotid is about to burst because I'm so upset.
Well, I don't know about you, but at least for me, experiencing the bullying as a kid and the racism as a kid, at that age, and I think, I mentioned this, when we were talking amongst ourselves last week. I think one advantage that like you and I have in terms of being parents is that we have now grown up in American culture, and we've been able to guide our kids through a lot of the significant milestones, whereas, our parents being, immigrants, or at least your mom being an immigrant in this case, did not have that same experience growing up in America. So I couldn't really look to my parents for how to behave in certain situations that are very common, social situations for most kids growing up in this country. And as a result, I tended to reject a lot of my heritage at that age and just tried to fit in as much as I could. And of course, I regret that now.
Right. I feel the same.
Yeah.
I mean, I think compounded with that sort of feeling of not having a parent who was able to guide me in that way, I also was not feeling particularly accepted by other Asians.
Yeah.
Or so, I think it's the being mixed component of all this, I think made my experience somewhat different than if I was just full on Korean or any minority person who is full on one thing, because at least in those cases, you have a sort of a singular culture and identity that not only can you fall back on, but they tend to embrace you.
Yeah.
As one of their own.
Yeah.
And I kind of felt a little bit like a mutt, to put it bluntly.
Right.
And so, and to be honest, where I grew up in Newark, Delaware, there weren't a ton of Asian people around, period.
Yeah.
So my only real prolonged exposure to other Asian people was a trip that I took to Korea when I was 13 with my mom. And I don't think that went so well in terms of, my developing any kind of bond or connection and that kind of thing. So in a lot of ways, a sense of like shared identity with either other Koreans or, and obviously with your father gone by the time you're 6, there's literally no connection to my Irish side.
Right.
At that point in my life. So I think that's where my entry into music, maybe that entry point is a little different for me than it was for other people, because that's where I sort of begin to turn to music, not only as a place where I can escape and dream and fantasize about things, but it eventually, like, that becomes my ethnicity.
Yeah.
Like I relate to no other cultural aspect of anything in the world more than I relate to other musicians or people who love music, live for music,
right,
and that kind of thing. Like you being in a band and me having been in lots of bands, we can have a shorthand conversation that we understand very clearly about that experience.
There's a kinship.
Yeah, there's an immediate kinship. And that is where, after a certain point, I knew that's where I could seek and find connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny when you looked at bands growing up, at least for me, first of all, the idea of even being in a band at that age seemed so inaccessible. It just seemed like, how would I even start, living in the middle of Pennsylvania, being in a band, but also no Asian faces out there.
Right.
Like, that seemed like one extra step.
Nobody looked like us. And that's the thing. I don't know how conscious a kid is of that in the moment when they're young, but I definitely feel like not seeing examples of that, it made that dream seem a little more distant.
Yeah.
And yet the pull of it was so compelling that I guess you and I just fought past that.
Yeah.
Until, and even like becoming a musician and first starting to play was kind of a journey. I started out as a creative person in about like 7th, 8th grade, not playing music, but making home movies with a couple of my friends in which we were in a band.
Right, which you detail heavily in your book.
Yeah,
to much hilarity.
We built like, plywood guitars with like Party City balloons for strings. And that's how I fantasized about being in a band. And then within a year or two of that, you know how it is.
Yep.
Somebody from your class plays guitar and my friend had a drum set and I was very curious, and I would make any excuse to like go into his basement and like bang on his drums. And
Yeah.
slowly but surely you find a couple of people who also want to play music, everybody for their own reasons, but you have that, that enough cross in your Venn diagrams to be like, okay, you like men at work, I like men at work.
We can do something with this.
We can do something with this. Yeah. So that's where it kind of slowly begins. And then once you're in it, like as far as my mentality was, I never wanted to stop.
Yeah, you just loved it.
It's just all one long progression in my mind.
Yeah. And it's interesting. The subtitle of your book is talking about being life on the cusp, right? And it just seems like you've been existing in the cusp of so many things at so many different parts of your life.
Yeah.
Existing on the cusp of fame, existing on the cusp of, between cultures.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think you draw from that, where you live in that existence at so many times?
Well, I mean, obviously for the first however many years or even decades of living like that, you feel very much like an outsider, and you feel, all the things we talked about before. You feel like you're different, and not yet in a good way. And I think my personal progression over time has been to actually embrace where I am in the scheme of things, and understand that it's actually not a bad place to be, because it does make me different. But now I kind of see it as being different in a good way. And I think that was a kind of a hard won realization, because for better or worse, like I am not your typical anything.
For sure.
I mean, I was, obviously like a Korean Irish heritage is extremely unusual. My parents were definitely on the older side when I was born. My mom was 40, my father was 62, which means you had older parents. One of them dies very early on. Mm-hmm. Your mother is an immigrant. She's a working person, I mean, so I was kind of very much sort of left to my own devices, which is why I think I lived in my head from an early age. Yeah. And I was able to sort of, make these harebrained schemes and, strange dreams kind of come true for myself. Yeah. Maybe not in the way I envisioned, but I think ultimately in a much richer way.
Yeah, the path you followed just led you to so many places, made so many connections. And as you say, just the way you lay it out in the book, it just seems like one long tapestry.
Yeah. And I feel almost like, let's say everything stops at the pinnacle of the Caulfields in 1995. I could very well today, like if that song had gone further than it did, like it charted in the top 40 in modern rock, which is very respectable. But let's say it became, a top 10 hit. I could be one of those guys that my whole life today is like, going around on package tours and playing to crowds who just want to hear that one song.
Yeah.
And I think that I've been really very lucky that Devil's Diary, the people that remember it seem to remember it fondly, but it doesn't define me.
Right.
Yeah. I've gone on to do so many other things. I feel like I've been granted the gift of, the proverbial 9 lives musically.
Yeah.
Which I don't think everybody gets to do. And I've been saying to people for a while now, I mean, I would take the opportunity to make 15 records over the span of a career over 15 minutes of fame any day. And I feel lucky about that.
And I think, I think we all have those bands or those artists who we just love because they are who they are, and we seem to understand, they seem to speak to us. Mm-hmm. And, we just kind of go along for the ride. Like and I know, among your fandom, there are just people who are just looking for the next thing you're going to do, and they will absolutely be there to read your book, to listen to your album, to see your shows, because you just keep, as you say, keep evolving, and they want to know what's happening next.
And how lucky is that for me?
And the circumstances like you talk about basically gave you that opportunity.
Right. And it's sort of
Oh, did we lose you? We might have frozen up there a second.
Okay. Well, I see you now.
Okay, I can hear you again.
Back?
There, you're back.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
All right.
Phew.
Another scare.
Yeah. Just to go back to one of the things you mentioned about your mom, like for me, for example, like I think my mom, in a lot of ways was, as you might say, traditionally Chinese.
Mhm.
But I think I always had her support. Like my brothers and I always had her support no matter what we did. Like I remember once she told me she was out with her friends and they were all saying their sons and daughters are all doctors and lawyers. And she was very proud, like my son's in a rock band.
Ah.
And it sounds like your mom was also very supportive throughout your entire career.
She was incredibly supportive, maybe not in the most overt of ways. I think that, and I don't know what your mom's experience with like rock music or pop music was, before you started playing it.
Yeah.
But my mom had no exposure to that before she came
Mhm.
to the States. And it was only through my sisters, who were teenagers when I was born, their record collection became like the soundtrack of our household
Yeah.
as I was growing up. And that was my mother's first literal exposure to any Western music, period. And so by the time I was writing songs and starting to think about making a career out of it, I think that like I think this is just a mom thing, and maybe specifically an Asian mom thing, but it's not so much that she isn't supporting it, but she's just worried for you.
That's it. The financial stability
He just
was the
wants
big one.
you to
Yeah.
be secure and safe, and that's why they come to this country. That's why they encourage their kids to study to be doctors and lawyers and stuff like that, because
Yeah.
there's a perceived security and all of that. But honestly, over time, I kind of have come to feel that I have a lot of job security in what I do because I'm self-employed.
Yeah.
Like,
You can't fire
the
yourself.
only person that can fire me is me. But yeah,
Yeah.
my mom was incredibly supportive. I mean, she always showed up to my shows when the Caulfields and the band that preceded it, the Beat Clinic, were playing throughout
Yeah.
the 3 counties of Delaware. She would always be there with the other band moms,
Yeah.
and it felt great to have that.
Yeah.
I don't know that she fully understood everything that I was trying to say as a songwriter or a musician,
Yeah.
or understood everything that I was doing in order to foster that dream coming true. But she never told me to quit. And in fact, at the precise moment where I think I was the most vulnerable to being convinced that I should quit, which was after the Caulfields broke
Mhm.
up, she is the person that basically pep talked me out of that
Yeah.
and told me that, the more she observed what I was doing and how dedicated I was to it, that, that I couldn't give up. This was who I was now.
So even though she didn't always get the music or what you're writing, she knew it was important to you, and
Exactly.
she was, yeah.
Yeah.
I loved in the book how you said she would often refer to your band as your team,
Yes.
and she saw. And it's interesting,
What's up, your team,
yeah.
honey? That was
But like so for somebody like me who sort of straddles a professional life and playing in a band, I often see a lot of the same dynamics playing out on a business team as I do in
sure.
a band, it's very insightful, I think, to call your
It
band your
was
team.
incredibly insightful of my
Yeah.
mom. It infuriated me at the time. I was like, "We're not a team," and she would always use the term at a point where I was pissed off at everybody else in the band or something, and it's
Yeah.
like, well, I don't want to be on this team.
But it
But
seems
yeah,
like she saw the significance of
absolutely.
having a team, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, and that's
Yeah.
you know almost everything she did and said turned out to be true or insightful.
Yeah.
But because of who I was at the time, I didn't receive those things in the moment the
Yeah.
way that I probably would today. So again, there was so much value for me to be able to look back at the things that she said and be like, oh yeah, you were right about that.
Parents
I
really
was,
plant those little time capsules in your brain, right? You know, like
yeah.
you ignore it at the time, and then suddenly you're at a point in your life where you're like, oh yeah, they were right. They said that.
Especially the thing with the team, I mean, because I think that she realized before I could wrap my head around it, like how important that connection actually was. I mean,
Yeah.
I knew it on sort of a unspoken level, but I would never have said at that time, like, the fact that we're so deeply connected is so important to me, guys.
Yeah.
Like, that's not what you're doing.
Right. And you
you
don't
know,
realize it at the time.
you
Yeah.
don't realize it.
Yeah.
And so there's so many things that she did and said that I look back on, and it makes me smile because I'm like, yeah, all right, yeah, you nailed that one on the
You were right.
head. Yeah,
Yeah.
you know.
I think there's so many parts of life like that where you hear something that you're not ready to hear, so you just kind of filed away until you reach
Right.
that point in your life. Even in music, like when I used to take lessons, I've learned some scale that I would never thought I'd use, but suddenly, years later, I'm like, oh, that's what they were talking about. That suddenly clicks into place.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we all have those moments where, you're just not ready in at the time that you're hearing something to really accept it or receive it.
Yeah.
But luckily, so many of the things that she said, I retained for later appreciation.
Yeah. Just filed away.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm going to look at the chat for a bit here. Going back to what we were talking about. John says Devil's Diary led me to John Faye Power Trip. Like basically all of your progression of bands as you went along.
Et cetera. I think that's a little nod to something I say in the book.
Yeah.
My Yul Brynner impersonation.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Here's one from Faye. John, knowing you for almost 1 year, can you talk about finding out that you and your father and brother all shared a name?
Yeah. Well, yes. So Faye is my niece. So last year, or on Father's Day, Faye reached out to me on Facebook and introduced herself and said, my grandfather was named John Faye. I think we're related.
Wow.
And through that initial exchange, I was able to connect with my brother, who is also named John, and connect with Faye, this is all very interesting. Faye is her first name now, but it used to be her last name. But I think she sat behind a girl who had the same name as her in elementary school. And so what happened was they just started calling her by her last name.
Interesting.
So she's been going by Faye her whole life.
But it's all very Dickensian.
Finding out that we were all named John was it was a weird moment.
Your dad liked the name and he stuck with it.
Yeah. She's mentioning the George Foreman thing.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, it was just such a strange thing because early in my life, I was definitely kept on I guess what you would call a need to know basis on a lot of things. I didn't know a thing about my father's side of the family, except when I was in my 20s. My mother gave me this bag of memorabilia that my father had kept throughout his life. And in this bag was two photographs that are compelling. One was of a young man in a military uniform that ended up being my brother John. Okay. I assumed that it was my father's son. I knew that he had been married previously. And so I walked into my mom's room almost confrontational. I was like, who's this? He's like, that's your brother.
Wow.
What's his name? John. So it was,
yeah.
I think it was just one of many sort of surreal moments when when you learn about your parents and that's one of the things that I sort of came to realize in writing the book is that so often, and I don't know, I mean, sometimes people never come to this point, but I think for a lot of our young lives, we never see our parents as whole people,
Hmm.
you know? And I think that this incident where my mother gave me all this memorabilia of my father, who, you know, as I said, was 62 when I was born. So I only knew of the man as kind of an older guy for
Yeah.
the 6.5 years I knew him. So to see photographs of him as a teenager, as a guy in his 20s, doing all these cool things. You know, he was an athlete. He played baseball. He boxed. He played football. You know, saved all his clippings, you
Yeah.
know, throughout the years. Like I was like, that's kind of like me in a little bit of, you know, like if you're in a band, you
Yeah.
know, if you get a little blurb in the local paper, you're cutting that out and you're putting it in a scrapbook or whatever.
I've got the box and the books over there.
Exactly. And so like in some weird way, like that made me feel the most connected to my dad. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, he kind of had a little taste for, you know, saving his clippings.
Yeah. So did your mom not share much about that, or did you have to, or would she share when you deliberately asked about your father, or even
My
about
mom was
her?
not a sharer.
Yeah.
She had to be prodded at all times to
Yeah.
divulge information. So I mean, um, you know, I don't think she had a ton of information about my father's family, really. I'm sure she knew a few things, but
Yeah.
you know, it turns out like the more I get to know my brother and the more I get to know Faye, like, you know, I'm finding out things about my dad that are, you know, kind of wild,
Yeah.
you know, because there's this period, um, you know, when maybe he's in his 30s, 40s, 50s, where, you know, like he was like a Philly cop.
Wow.
You know, he had like a whole life and career
Yeah.
that I wasn't, you know, maybe I was aware of. I knew he was a police officer because I remember his gun was in my mother's drawer.
All right. Right. Yeah.
But like, just to see photographs of that, it's been pretty wild.
Yeah.
It's
Well, thank
just,
goodness for social media and Faye
yeah,
reaching out
I
to you.
mean, it's been one of the greatest things to be able to get to know that part of my family
Yeah.
and feel like I have more family now,
That's amazing.
you know, because like actual blood relations throughout my life have been like, you know, most people can say, oh, we went to like the family reunion barbecue last week. There was like 75 cousins there and this and that.
Yeah.
And for me, it was literally, you know, my nuclear family growing up, you know, and obviously all of my siblings are half. I don't
Right.
have any full siblings.
Yeah.
I didn't have any exposure to obviously anyone on my father's side until last year. Had never met any of my 4 grandparents except once when I went to Korea when I was 13. So a lot of those bonds and connections that many people are able to feel throughout their lives, I just didn't have,
Yeah.
you know.
Did you
So
miss it? Do you feel it? Did you feel like you missed that?
I don't know. I don't know
Yeah.
that you can miss what you never had,
Yeah.
really, particularly. But I do know that that's why music becomes so important,
Yeah.
because it's the space in which I can form those bonds that feel like family, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to touch on the songwriting a bit. Like, what is your process when it comes to songwriting these days? Do you set aside time to work? Do you wait till inspiration strikes?
I don't set aside time.
Yeah. Do you find yourself rushing to get your guitar at times? Oh, I think we just froze up again. Give us a second. You're back.
I'm back, and so are you.
Yes.
On my screen, we disappear simultaneously.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, so most of my song seeds, if you want to call it that, are generally like lyrical or title based. So it's not like I have a musical idea that I got to run to my guitar for.
Hmm.
It's usually like it's an idea for
Yeah.
a song that's rooted in words. So if I have like a line or a title that is compelling, usually that happens in a strange setting, like very often while I'm driving,
Yeah.
or in the shower. Ideas will come to me there. So I have to like make sure that I retain them until I can get to somewhere to write it down or put it in my phone or whatever.
And what, like, to get a little technical here, what are your tools these days? Do you use the voice memo thing? Do you try to record guitar and voice?
Sometimes, yeah, I've got a large selection of voice memos on my phone. Just the notes section in an iPhone is incredibly handy.
Yeah.
I was actually going through it just yesterday just to see if there was anything that I should revisit that.
Yeah.
Just some dumb line that, or very often I'll see lines and I'll be like, why was that an idea? Why were you compelled to put that in your phone?
Yeah.
That's not a thing. But sometimes you get a thing.
Yeah. Sometimes that's songwriting in a nutshell. Sometimes you get a thing.
Right. I taught this subject for 16 years, and that's
the long and short of it.
The whole thing.
Do you feel like your writing, like, how has your writing evolved over these years of your career?
Well, I think it's been a progression of being comfortable in my own voice, not singing voice, but like broader capital V voice. Yeah. So the willingness to be vulnerable, the ability to tap into places that are perhaps uncomfortable to write or sing about. I actually feel pretty comfortable doing that. Yeah. Like I if something ends up, like, I think I have a pretty good sense of where very strong emotion might morph into something maudlin or too cringy. I hope I still have that sensibility about me. So I feel like I'm able to ride a little bit of a line where, like, I can be like very, very raw emotionally and still maintain my dignity.
I honestly think that's one of the big appeals of your music, is that rawness and that sort of vulnerability that's not only present in your music, but now very present in your book.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's just something that's important to me, that almost on a broader cultural level. Like, I feel like vulnerability is so tamped down in so many ways. We're just sort of trained to be,
especially in the days of social media, these days of social media.
Right? Just have our guard up and just always be tough, never apologize, like, just bullshit.
Everything's cool. Everything we do is cool. Yeah.
And so, like, if I had a broader goal with just in the way that I'm presenting, like, what I do creatively, it's that it's not only okay to be vulnerable, it's actually what makes better art.
Yeah, absolutely. I think anybody can sort of instinctively sense, like, the sincerity versus insincerity,
right,
in writing.
Remember The Great Pumpkin?
Yes.
Sincerity as far as the eye
can see. Yeah. John's music, sincerity as far as the eye can see.
That's right. The next album cover will just be Linus in a pumpkin patch.
Maybe The Great Pumpkin will show up.
Yeah. Is there any other questions on
here? We have some nice comments talking about music is like the bonds that feels like family. Incredible insight. Yes. Mm-hmm. So where can people go to find you these days?
Well, I work very hard on maintaining and updating my website, johnfaye.com. So,
there it is.
How convenient. And on there's all different ways to not only order the book, but there's a pretty in-depth section on, like, my musical history, like a timeline. And there's also a lot of information for what I'm very much interested in sort of pivoting into nowadays, which is to sort of present my musical side as sort of a combination of songs and stories. So I play songs and tell stories from the book. And I've actually been doing that pretty frequently these days for some private events. And I'm looking to do more of that kind of thing. So if anybody out there is, looking for like a unique speaker for an event that would involve a musical element, I am very much in the midst of booking a lot of stuff.
Absolutely. And, I've always thought of you as a storyteller on top of everything else that you do, because you can really you put together a great story.
The
So
guy
yeah.
in a yarn.
Yeah. So in combination with your music, I think that'll be a fantastic show.
Well, thank you.
And people can contribute to you at, you have a Patreon?
I do, yes. I have a Patreon, patreon.com/John Kim Faye. There's exclusive content on there that I really, really enjoy putting together. It's a whole different, kind of more long form videos.
Mm-hmm.
And this year is the 20th anniversary of a record that I did with my band Ike called Parallel Universe. And so I'm doing a couple of little fun videos to celebrate that anniversary. And so there's always new stuff on there that that I'm trying to put together.
And you've invited some of your patrons to join you in some of your recordings and videos, I think.
Yeah, well, that's another aspect of wanting to form community through music, because so much of what I record for myself nowadays is done in a very solitary fashion. Like I basically do all my songs on a MacBook Pro.
Yeah.
Which is cool. Like I really, really enjoy working in Logic and creating songs in that mode, because I think it's just opened up my creativity in a way that just being in the studio might, with the clock ticking, it's a little different. But there have been a number of examples where I have a song that maybe has like a gang vocal on it. So I invite my people from Patreon to join me in the studio and be part of that. And it's just the couple times that I've done it, it's been a great experience, because, you're there with, 15 or 20 people who really are supporting you in a huge way.
Yeah.
These are not just people who are clicking like, these are people that are having a little something from their bank account going out every month, which is, an amazing thing that I'm extremely grateful for. And so it's just a fun way to interact with that group of people. And I even have people who aren't from, my general geographic region, like they can email me their track. They can just see it at home, and it all just gets blended in.
Put it all together. Yeah.
Big gang vocal. And it's really cool. And I think it lets everybody feel genuinely that they are a part of what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Not
really
only
are.
supporting it, they're it. They are part of it,
And it's so interesting to me, like how much you say you enjoy working in Logic and putting together your music yourself. Do you find that removes that barrier of having to work with an engineer, having to work with, a producer at the same time? I mean, and there's a time and a place, obviously, but for the immediacy of working on your music, do you find yourself almost preferring that these days?
I think that's why I like it, because there's no sort of as you said, there's no barrier between me having an idea and just being able to attempt to execute it. Now, this is not to say that I don't involve other people.
Sure.
Like all my songs, once I track everything, I definitely take them into a bigger studio to be mixed and mastered and that kind of thing. And that absolutely takes those home recordings to the level of, being a record and that kind of thing. And it's not that I don't enjoy playing music with other people, but one of the things that I think that I feel like if I have an idea, I just want to try to do it. And sometimes I'm a good enough guitar player to execute it. And if I'm not, I call somebody who is
some people
who is better than me to do it. But even like for bass now, like I've started doing this really cool thing where I'm doing sort of like vocal bass lines, which I convert to MIDI.
Wow.
Which end up being like bass lines that I couldn't necessarily play myself, but I can hear them in my head and I can sing them. So that's kind of a new fun
cool
route that I've been going down for a couple of tunes lately, and it's very cool.
And are you self-teaching most of the stuff?
Yes.
Yeah.
YouTube is my friend. There's a couple of I bookmarked a couple of YouTube videos that remind me how to do certain things, but
you could also visit linkedin.com/learning.
Well, if that's an option, I'm new to the LinkedIn platform. I don't know if you were aware of that.
Yes, I wanted to say thank you for creating an account just to do this with this.
Well, I've never had a proper job.
But you've got quite a resume.
Employable, right?
Yeah. But if anybody wants to connect with John here on LinkedIn, you can just go to this address, and I'm sure you will connect with anybody who wants to connect with you.
Yes, I would love that. I would absolutely love that.
Oh, and if anybody has any more comments or questions, please add them. And if you're watching this on the repeat, you can continue to add comments and questions. And John, you'll stop by and take a look at them.
Stop by, yes.
Yeah. You'll get those little notifications.
Now that I'm part of the LinkedIn community, I'll be dropping by.
Yeah. Actually, I want to take a look at one more comment here. Jennifer says the response to the book has been chronicled by you. Are you surprised at its success? The success of the book?
Well, I mean, I guess there's an insecure part of every creative person that is always surprised if their work is validated. Does that mean I don't think it deserves it, or I feel like any kind of like imposter syndrome over it? I mean, I definitely went through those. You go through those phases in the creative process, and it definitely wasn't until I handed the book off to the guy that ultimately edited the book when I realized, yes, it's actually a book and not just like 350 pages of ramblings.
Yeah.
So I'm obviously pleasantly surprised that, I mean, I do think that the response to it has been beautiful. I mean, it's exactly, I couldn't ask for more.
Yeah.
Because the people that have connected with the book have really deeply connected with it. We've gotten a ton of Amazon reviews that are just really, really heartfelt. Yeah. Although it's funny, a couple of the ones I've read lately, they definitely use ChatGPT to write those.
Oh, really?
I was like, could you not write your review from the heart? But whatever, it's cool.
Yeah.
Just the fact that people are taking the time to read it or listening to it on audio. And so, yeah, I mean, it's something that I'm kind of looking at as like a marathon and not a sprint kind of a thing. I mean, the actual marketing period for the book will probably last another couple of months, but by then I hope to sort of be very, very deep in the world of trying to do engagements where I'm doing the songs and stories and basically telling my story in an unusual format that I think hopefully will resonate with a lot of people. Yeah. And thereby will sell even more books, hopefully.
Yes. Did it give you a writing bug, or were you happy to finally, put the proverbial pen down, or do you think you'll keep maybe with essays or another book?
Yeah, I mean, I do have thoughts in the back of my mind that maybe I would write some more stuff down the line, but it's really not something that I'm going to do immediately, because one of the things that I had to put on the back burner for the 6 years that it's been since I started writing this was actually, being a musician and putting out records and stuff. And that's a big priority. Like I've actually been, I've been producing a lot of artists these days. And now I think I'm finally seeing a window of time where I'm going to be able to work on a few of my own songs again. And, and I want to be able to put music out. I mean,
and I'm sure people, as much as they love the book, are really eager to hear the next audio recordings from you.
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, I'm excited about the stuff that I've been writing, and I'm excited to turn them into recordings and do that. So there's a lot that's sort of in front of me before I get to the point where I'm like, okay, what's the next book?
Yeah.
I think that's a ways away, if it happens at all. But one thing that I've learned is to never say never about it.
Well, I'm sure the next album or anything you create will just be more fodder for the next book.
Very possibly.
Awesome. Hey, well, thanks so much, man. This has been I'm really glad we got a chance to sit down and actually do it for real this week.
It was a total pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to catching up in real life sometime soon.
Yes, absolutely.
And thanks again to everybody for joining us. And again, please continue with your comments and questions, and we will be getting notifications, so we will continue to address them. Thanks again, John.
Yes, thank you, Garrick, and thank you everyone for hanging out.
All right, thanks. Take care.
Take care.